Hello and welcome to the show with Satish Jha. You must have heard about the inflation that's going to hit us all. You must have heard about the successive days. Every day, government has been raising fuel prices. Now, that's a bit extraordinary. Governments normally raise them thoughtfully, once in a while, once in a few months, once in a year. But raising them every day, that requires a special talent. And that talent obviously belongs to our current regime, which is totally inexplicable unless someone can explain to me why would a government, which is so well organized and so huge in terms of total size, whatever we may say, we belong to the top 10 governments in just size. $2 trillion? Yes, we could have been three and a half by now if we followed the 2004 to 14 trajectory, but that's another matter. A $2 trillion still puts us in the kind of club, which is US, China, Japan, Germany, now UK, France, and somewhere immediately India and Italy will start showing up. So that's the kind of block we belong to. When it comes to inflation and price, the way we are handling it this time, it's something which is not easy to understand. Why is the government doing what it is doing? I can't ever forget the fact that when Mrs. Gandhi first became the Prime Minister in 1966, she was asked by the media and she was clearly not prepared for the role she had taken up in terms of managing economy at least. And she said there are two great challenges facing the nation: inflation and price rise. Someone somewhere goofed up. So yes, inflation and price rise, they basically, as you understand, they represent the same phenomena, differently measured. And one is what the economists see as a metrics, other is what you and I feel. So now what we're feeling is that 3 to 4 rupees of increase in petrol and diesel prices in past 3-4 days or 5 days. That's extraordinary. Why is the government doing that? And as you know, 31st of March, they have to balance the books. As we know that they did not raise the prices when the crisis occurred. And as we understand, Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum and Hindustan Petroleum have suffered a loss of something close to 20,000 crore rupees. And that's not a trivial number. So government has to make up for that because all these public sector accounts ultimately get into somewhere in the government books. And so through the money they pay them, the subsidies given to them, or the profits they give to the government. So now the challenge is that these companies have suffered because of the purchase prices, but they shouldn't have suffered. If you're managing our economy well, it doesn't really make a difference in the short run. It may make a difference in the books, but not the short run management of the companies or the economy. Because we basically purchase over a long haul. We have long-term contracts, which are fixed price contracts. We hedge our bets. In other words, we agree to buy in future for a given price. And we do all kinds of things to stabilize our economy and our outgo of foreign exchange resources in particular, because foreign exchange resource management is a key element of managing our economy or even business if you have a lot of international trade in your business. So why would government not be aware of that and allow such a situation to happen? That's something intriguing. Secondly, the fact is that people will begin to feel the overall impact of inflation as soon as they start now paying for petrol, because now it's paying 100 rupees instead of 90 or 85. Suddenly you see, because the government may raise it by 3.204, but what happens at the petrol pump level varies from city to city, state to state, and somewhere the impact is there are many places where petrol or diesel being sold for more than 100 rupees per liter, which is way beyond what people could have imagined. Fuel being the fuel of the economic engine as well, it has multiplier effect on prices. And if you see inflation and price rise, as we call them, they happen because partly when the government mismanages the economy, partly because there are international challenges, and certainly price of petroleum related products is a major input in those. And it can also happen that when some key commodities they get traded, suddenly fall in a short supply, and they create problems, or interest rate is managed in such a way that government can't control inflation. So these are some of the ways of looking at that, and economists can enlighten us with a lot of nicer ways of looking at it. But essentially, when some major event happens which impacts supplies, when government mismanages because they don't anticipate well, they don't plan well, or a whole host of things that can go wrong, and some shortage of supply of key commodities, and petrol, obviously, petrol, diesel. If you keep that framework in mind, right now we are going through what is a petroleum-led crisis, and that you can say is Russia-Ukraine-led crisis. And we could not have anticipated well in advance, but Ukrainian possibility was on the block for quite some time, for several months. CIA had warned that for about at least 6 months plus, and America obviously was instigatory. If you hear many analysts, they will all today say it's a crisis created for some purpose which we don't understand. It's like a chess game. Those who play these big games, they play like chess games. So we see the next move, but they're playing for the fifth or sixth possibility moves as such. And that's exactly why foreign policy results are very often not exactly the way you want it. And because who knows what the fourth or fifth or sixth move is going to be, and everybody is not either Anand Vishwanathan or Kasparov and so on and so forth in foreign policy. But it's a chess game because you play, you're trying to anticipate others' moves, and you're trying to see how far we can go in imagining what the fourth or fifth move is going to be. So, in this case of petrol price rises, it's a bigger thing. I think, like we talked about earlier on, the ratio of consumption to domestic production is 1:5. So we import about 4 or 5 all the time. And if the price increases or doubles, and that means 80% of our consumption basically is going to be at a double price, that can totally ruin the economy and the kind of quality of life the poor can have. And in price rise, people who are in the top 3, 4, 5%, they can absorb it. They're a little crib about it, they can absorb it. Those who are below in the below 80%, and the bottom 80% of people, they will have very, very tough time because they have no leverage in terms of how much money, how many resources they have. They barely get by as it is. So if the prices go up by 6 to 10% or 15 or 20, as the case could be, right now we are running at about close to 7%, 6.6 to 7%. It could easily be in about next couple of months inching towards 8, 9, 10. I don't anticipate the government would allow it to go beyond into double digits. That will be really quite something that I can't anticipate or expect them to do so. But moving towards 7, 8, 9%, it impacts the poorest very, very hard as such. So if you see our overall 50 years of inflation pattern, you will find that it happened, the peaks and troughs happened around in the 70s when oil prices went up, and finally we got used to it and it got managed. Later on again, a shock on 80, and so you see the international crude prices and you see the inflation rate in India. And a couple of times mismanagement totally. And the mismanagement is not going to be very long if it's because of commodity prices like onions or potatoes or some such thing here and there. That will be a shorter duration as such. So India, in terms of economy, we have generally managed better than what we are doing at this point in time. Sometimes when international crisis arises, and we did very, very well compared to most countries during 2008-9. In 74, 75, we were not as prepared, but we did pretty well. But you saw the price rise was such, and the political equations came together to basically create a situation of chaos and emergency and all that. It was not just one thing that was going in that direction. There were plenty of things happening, and economy was also one key player in the process, which we don't talk about much because political issues were so huge that we didn't talk much about other underlying factors. So now we are getting into Congress trying to basically say that we will create a movement to have a inflation-free regime. They're also talking about taking on Modi, calling him a king. King is obviously living lavishly, while the subjects, of course, we are not subjects. Technically, we are not. Constitutionally, we are not. But we are being treated almost in the same way as of now. Or that's the feeling being created, or at least Congress would like to portray that in these times as such. So people are hurting, and the king or the elected prime minister is basically having a very lavish life. No prime minister has lived this lavishly as the current prime minister. No prime minister. Just imagine the wealth of Nehru in the times he lived in. His father was someone who donated a whole house to Congress party at one time. He was known as someone who was among the rich lawyers or individuals of his times. And Nehru, in that sense, understood what wealth was and the way he lived in and learned for an individual. Indira Gandhi didn't have to see a lack of, you can say, affluence, and nor did Rajiv Gandhi. So these were the initial leaders we had, but they did not live like this. I've seen them living, and I can guarantee that they all lived as simply as anybody could. Even until now, Sonia Gandhi used to sit in ambassador. It's not they can't afford better cars, but it behooves a public leader not to be seen as someone who is different from the population or people who vote for them. But our dear leader has chosen to be the most extravagant of all heads of states, barring the communist, say Russia for that matter, Japanese prime minister or American president or British prime ministers. They live very modestly from that point of view. There is infrastructure is available, but they don't show off. If they did show off, in fact, I've read many stories about it. If a presidential candidate walked into during the primaries looking slightly upscale, probably he will lose the elections. It was very simple. And even afterwards, if they lived that way, they will not be seen as representing people, because they should feel like people too. So, but that's another question, but Congress is raising it, that our dear leader lives like a king while people are suffering, and they will make, of course, they can't make much because they are not in power, but they're trying to launch a movement which will say, Mehngai Mukt Bharat. Of course, you can't ever Mehngai Mukt, but some percentage of price rise is quite understandable. America has had a great time for quite a few years until now, and suddenly its inflation, but funnily, is being seen as one of the you can say highest rates of inflation in 40 years. But at the same time, you also see the unemployment is down and has been lowest in 50 years. So which is somehow very surprising that inflation and employment, the relationship is just the reverse of what we see there. That said, I think government at one time used to have quality economists. Right now, I don't quite know because their record is yet to be analyzed. So I leave it at that. With that, I'll take your leave for the next edition of the Satish Jha show. Until then, thank you.